This is the Asia Climate Capital podcast hosted by me, Joseph Jacobelli. The series is dedicated to discussing and analyzing business and finance topics around the energy transition and decarbonization in Asia, with the capital markets in mind. Welcome to episode 12 of the Asia Climate Capital podcast, recorded on July 14, 2022. I'm your host, Joseph Jacobelli. Today we go back to discussing Australia, a topic we only just addressed in episode 10 with Tim Buckley. And the reason is because of two developing events. One is the newly elected government pro-climate green push, and the other is the massive energy crisis in the country is facing right now as we speak. Now, previously, we addressed Australia mostly from a top-down perspective. Now, I think it's quite important to look at it from a bottom-up view. To do this, I have the pleasure and the honor to have Rebecca Tilbrook, a former teammate when I was working at CLP Holdings in late 2000s. Rebecca brings quite a unique operational expertise, given her experiences in Greater China, her experiences in North America, and of course down in Australia. As per usual, the Asia Climate Capital podcast will first hear a little bit about how Rebecca got involved into Asia's decarbonization, a little bit about her background. Then we'll dig into the current key issues facing the Australian clean energy markets, business and finance-wise from a bottom-up perspective. And finally, we'll hear some of Rebecca's long-term forecasts and predictions. As always, all of the guests' views and opinions are personal and do not in any way reflect those of past or present employers. So, hi, Rebecca, and welcome to the Asian Climate Capital podcast. How are you?
I'm really good, Joseph. How are you?
I'm very, very, very good. So I wanted this very long distance conversation, given that I'm in Europe right now and you're in Australia, by asking you briefly to just explain your path to today's involvement in energy transition and decarbonization, knowing that you started, you were, let's say, well ahead of the curve.
I like to think that. It's been about 20 years, more than 20 years since I got interested in the industry. You know, it started super early for me in picking my university degree to specialize in renewable energy, which at the time people thought I was kind of crazy. But, you know, I feel like it's probably paid off for us all. So I started out in, developing solar and wind farms in Australia, really, and working with a lot of utilities back then. And like you said, we met at CLP Holdings in the late 2000s because I went over there to try to help CLP, I suppose, with their clean energy ambitions at the time. And they, to be fair, were ahead of the curve, I think. You know, there was no regulatory reason for them to jump into that space. They just saw it as an opportunity to develop new energy projects in the region. So kudos to them. And I was with them for, you know, the time that I was in Hong Kong, about 5 years, and decided as a, you know, somewhat early in their career that should probably get a bit of different experience in different places. So I moved on to the US, and that's where I started getting a lot more experience in solar, both utility scale, and then eventually working with a firm that specialized in solar financing for behind-the-meter solar power purchase agreements that were quite unique as a business model. I feel like worked really well in the US environment. So I learned a lot in that space, and was there for 5 years all in the US, which was amazing. Met my husband there, which was also great. But then convinced him to move back to Australia with me in 2018. So, Australia has been, even though that was kind of in the midst of the last government And I guess, you mentioned Tim Buckley in your previous episode, and I think he had a lot of strong opinions about the previous government, so I'll leave it at that. But, it has come a long way since I originally left in the mid-2000s. So we're in this really peculiar kind of situation in the market here. And it's a really great time to be in clean tech and renewables and energy more broadly.
And what's your involvement, today, more specifically in the kind of clean energy game down in Australia?
Yeah, so at the moment I'm working for Hydro Tasmania. So they're a government business enterprise owned by the Tasmanian state government. They have been around for about 100 years in some shape or form from a corporation perspective. And we are doing a few things. So we're Tasmania's, preeminent renewable energy generator, or biggest generator there. I think we are Australia's largest renewable energy generator from an energy perspective. And we also have a retailer called Momentum Energy that services the national electricity market outside of Tasmania, so from a retail perspective. So I work with them to sort of bring in either new clean tech opportunities or different business models or different innovative kind of products and services to help service our energy customers, I guess.
And that's really the intersection of what is happening. So you're right in the middle of the intersection of what's happening in terms of building up the clean energy generation system around Australia, but also at the same time, the digitalization kind of aspect to it, which I've argued quite often that it's two things which are happening in parallel, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. Now let's if I start picking your brain, if I may, on kind of like the key current topics. Now I would love to hear about your personal views on some key issues, opportunities, and challenges in today's clean energy markets in Australia. Maybe perhaps we could just start very, very briefly with a top-down recap from your perspective on, let's call it the main headline news right now. And then we could perhaps chat about what it really all means from a bottoms-up perspective. In other words, the operational angle.
Yeah, sure. So I think the episode number 10, did you say it was, with Tim Buckley, he covered a lot of really interesting components that are very relevant for what's happening in the market right now, right? So the main one is, what's going on with our quote-unquote energy crisis and the war in Ukraine having a big impact. So I feel like I don't need to go too much into that. If others want to learn more about it, I guess they can listen to episode 10. There's a lot of good stuff in that one. But let's just recognize and acknowledge that energy crisis is ongoing and it will continue to be present, I expect, for at least the short term, potentially the medium term, and who knows about long term. So there is going to be this underlying kind of uncertainty in our existing market unless something kind of changes with, well, in my view, the gas and domestic gas market and regulation around domestic gas pricing control there. But, broader than that, I think just last Tuesday, so our newish Prime Minister Anthony Albanese has announced that he has indeed committed that Australia will become a renewable energy superpower. So that's really in recognition of, the global demand for decarbonised resources and I guess our national need to produce and export these higher value products that leverage our existing natural advantage, right? So that's green steel, green ammonia, potentially other kind of clean technologies or clean products. And they're going to need this, spectacular amount of renewable energy to create these new industries and new products that have never needed energy before. abundance of, green hydrogen to produce green ammonia. So there's finally some top-down recognition of how incredibly well-positioned this country is to provide that on a global scale, and hopefully some leadership to enable the transition there, because it's not going to be easy at all to move us into that direction, just even from a pure supply kind of perspective, right? So there's a lot in the market that needs to change. Hopefully some of that can come from good policy, good regulation, and hopefully we don't need too much sort of taxpayer or public investment in it. Hopefully there's still a lot remaining in the private kind of capital equity markets that can fund a lot of that, and there is opportunity, so I expect that would be the case. It needs that leadership, it needs that good frameworks, and it needs that certainty, so that the money can start flowing.
Yeah, I think down in Australia, one of the key things, and like you mentioned, we mentioned that in quite a bit in episode 10 with Tim, is the fact that Australia was able to get where it is today, which is not in a bad place in terms of clean energy leadership, with absolutely no support from the federal government, largely driven by corporates, so the private sector, as well as some of the state governments. So I think Australia is in a good place in terms of starting to really gear up and try to get to this kind of leadership position, given it definitely has the potential. So we talked about kind of these top-down key factors, being obviously the shift to zero carbon, the energy crisis, the whole kind of saga with gas, and Australia's leadership potential. Now, breaking this down, let's chat a little bit more about the shift to zero carbon. You highlighted that there's a lot of you highlighted to me before that there's a lot of climate action on the part of large corporates. Something that's actually we see in Asia and the rest of the world as well. But you also said there's that's not necessarily true for small to medium-sized enterprises or SMEs. So, what is the biggest challenge preventing implementation? Could you talk about the business, the operational and financial challenges or barriers? Perhaps sorry.
Yeah, no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. There's a lot of discussion, especially at the macro level, about supply side, what we're doing with the energy infrastructure, with our generation, and all that sort of, for lack of a better word, macroeconomic kind of view of things, the national security and energy security discussion, etc. But something that always gets missed, and I think from a lot of market discussion, economist discussions, is really that bottom-up movement, so the demand of consumers, and even just saying the words like, what does the customer want, or the word customer in general, I think just is often lacking from these sorts of discussions, because who's really driving it? Like, what is the reason for this humongous shift to clean energy? And don't tell me it's because of climate change. Capital markets are not altruistic, and it's taken, even our government is being dragged kicking and screaming into doing something and providing these frameworks, and a lot of governments around the world are. And again, I will say that CLP Holdings was probably one of the few that recognized that as an opportunity, and did just chuck in some money into it, an investment. But really, it's driven because people want this change. People, consumers, moms and dads, like businesses, everyone, they see that there is this need, and they are trying to find a way for them to have their own impact and sort of create their own destiny, in a sense. So what can you control and what can you change in your current life at home, in your current business? What elements can you change to address climate change? Because it's not all going to be the government, you go and do what you need to do. It's about individual action as well. And I think especially in Australia, the climate strikes with, the kids and stuff like that. I do think it has had a big impact, especially on a lot of Western countries. And so what I see, and this is the nice thing about the position that I'm in right now, I get to chat to a lot of end users of energy. And for the most part, that's, SMEs or commercial and industrial users. So I'm not as much on the residential kind of retail side, right? Although that's part of the internal discussions that I have to be part of, definitely. But it's more like those larger energy users. And that comprises a giant segment of the Australian demand kind of in the market, right? So what are we seeing? A lot of the big, large corporates, especially multinationals, definitely moving in that direction. There's a lot of pressure on multinationals with subsidiaries in Australia, especially those with head offices in, say, Europe that are very attuned to this kind of issue. There's a lot of pressure from mothership to, change what's happening in Australia. They know that even connecting to our normal electricity grid in, say, Victoria, their scope 2 emissions are going to be through the roof compared to a lot of other places, in Europe, even in Australia. So it's sort of like, progressively addressing how can they reduce their climate impact through decarbonisation, through looking at their electricity or their energy supply, through looking at just their general operations and their broader sustainability planning, I suppose, as a business. It's very, very important. So the larger multinationals, they're going ahead, they kind of have the resources, they have the remit, they have the board and investor, push and drive for it. So they're doing all those things and they can engage those consultants. Some of them are expensive, and they can spend the time getting these things together, to make a very considered plan and a strong effort and take a position that also, differentiates them in the market. They see that as a key differentiator. They can highlight that in their marketing materials or to investors. People want to invest in companies that are thinking about this. So there's a massive opportunity for that. And that's great. And there's a lot out there that, is targeting those sorts of, let's call them informed customers. But there's a lot of other customers that are maybe smaller, don't have the resources, don't have the time. They don't have a sustainability officer dedicated to it or, an entire department dedicated to it. They might have a procurement team. They might not. That can, spend the time on it. So for the most part, how do that next rung of customers, energy users, how do they do their bit, I suppose, right? And that's, in Australia at least, some of the barriers that I've seen, that it's kind of, you're either talking to the really big end of town or you're down with the sort of residential product offerings, which is here green power, which, essentially is an audit trail for our renewable energy generation like credits. And so you're kind of stuck between somewhat of a rock and a hard place, knowing that you want to try to do something as a business and for your customers and for your, stakeholders, but not really knowing where to go and not having the time to figure it out. So, there are barriers there that I think will be overcome just by some tweaks, essentially, to the retail side of the energy market. It needs to happen, and I think there just has to be greater engagement with that sort of segment as well, because that's where the next big, decarbonisation movement has to come from. Many smaller businesses, rather than just like a few of the giant ones at the top. So that's something that I've been working on in my current role as well. Is just trying to remove the barriers and I guess the just the effort involved in it all, and just creating these really simple products, that look and feel like a normal retail energy product, but have all the bells and whistles of something that you would expect to be only targeted to the big end of town. So, yeah.
But who's helping? So say there's a smallish factory, 50, 100 people, and they were interested in the whole decarbonization game. At the operational level, where do they get the help? Is it from people like you and your company? Is it government? Because obviously they don't have the time, the resources, or the money to start looking into that. So where do they get the help from?
It's a really good question. And I think a lot of them ask the same kind of question and dwell on it potentially too long. Look, I think the energy market, in a way, almost has a responsibility to make it easier as well. So retailers, that would usually be, because they're the sort of front-facing towards the end customer. But at the moment, for the most part, it is consultants of some description. And there are some amazing consultants out there, but they're not all tailored to a quick, cheap solution for those like smaller customers. So my company is very open. Like we will work with people who and customers who are actively looking to reduce their emissions, and we have all the products to essentially remove all of your scope 2 carbon emissions. So that's all your electricity-based emissions. And I know there are others in the market that are doing this sort of thing as well, but I really think that retailers need to step up in a sense. I don't know how the likes of, let's just call them the big gentailers with lots of coal and gas on their books could do it effectively, but we're in this beautiful position where our generation comes from hydropower and wind and a bit of solar. And, so we can offer that decarbonised energy solution very easily. And I think that's part of where the market eventually needs to head to, especially as that supply side greens up.
Just digging into this topic, I can think of a few angles that we could be talking about. One is the whole development of decentralized energy and the potential for SMEs. Is that kind of part of the conversation? The second one is pluses and minuses of energy storage. I'm a huge believer in energy storage, but at the end of the day, I like to put it very simply. When you add energy storage to a system, it adds costs. So until energy costs, the energy storage is, going to be cheaper, and it is getting there very slowly but surely. Then that's an issue. And the third, so first is decentralized energy, second is energy storage, and the third one is the whole kind of electrification, which again sometimes is lost in a bit of conversation. And what I mean by electrification is obviously transport being the main one, and not just electric vehicles, but all forms of transport, and the interplay of electrification with SMEs and perhaps electrification and residential users as well. Do you have any thoughts or views on this decentralized energy storage or electrification?
Yeah, I mean that's kind of a two-part, I guess, question. So the first part, maybe I just touch on the electrification piece. There has been a bit of a groundswell, not just from a residential perspective, but from a business, a C&I perspective, to shift from the use of gas. And it's not just for transport. I'll say the electrification movement. There's a lot of processes in industry that are either gas driven because they have like a thermal component, so gas heating or something like that, or it's gas that's used as a feedstock, fertilizer production, etc., ammonia production, all those sorts of things, plastics that use the hydrocarbon sort of element of it. So, that some of these things can be electrified and some cannot easily be electrified. But the nice thing about the things that can be electrified, so say the thermal gas components, so there's maybe, boilers or ovens, for example, if you can switch those to electricity, then all of a sudden you can quite easily green up that component of your operations. Because otherwise with gas, you're just looking at, carbon offsets. And we recently in Australia had some controversy around, the origins and validity of carbon offsets in some of the schemes that are run by the government. The decarbonisation of the economy cannot happen without, offsets, right? So they do play an important role. But my personal opinion, and I think this is shared amongst a lot of, is that if you can just eliminate it at the source, that emissions from the source, then you should. You shouldn't be relying on that offset. And that could be a tapered kind of movement, but it should be eliminated at the outset. So I guess that's partially where that electrification in industry movement is sort of heading towards. But the other part of it is really not so much to do with decarbonisation and emissions, but literally just the supply and cost of gas. There's a lot of companies that I speak with that are worried about having a gas supply sufficient enough at all in the future. And I guess some of that has somewhat come to fruition with the war situation and our existing local gas industry, the domestic gas market, and the position that we're in at the moment. So if you were complaining about $7 a gig gas before, then you're sure complaining about $40 a gig right now. So I think there's an element of the sustainability element is within the economic sustainability of your company, in addition to the sort of environmental sustainability and your impact, on this planet. So they are coalescing as well at this point in time because of how the market's playing out. So I think that's really where that electrification piece is coming. The transport piece is massive, obviously, and I actually think, I think transport is I want to say third biggest carbon creator in Australia. Don't quote me on it, and if I'm wrong, please do let me know. But that is a huge, element of our of the economy that needs to be decarbonized and can be with existing technology. Not all of it will be able to, but I do think there's a lot of the consumer base, I guess, residential homes, people, end users that are just, driving around their regular cars that can switch to EV. And there's plenty of EVs on the market. There will be more in future. But what is really interesting, I think, to me, is the more heavy industry and heavy trucking, shipping, those sorts of, that transport sector where you're not parking your car for, 95% of its time, or your vehicle for 95%. You're probably driving it for, a solid 80% of it or something like that, or depending on how the fleet is operating and things like shipping. So you're not going to be getting electrical cargo ships, for example, right? So what are you going to do instead? And how do you decarbonize that element? So there's so much... there's so much more that needs to happen in that space, and it will have a huge impact. And I think we're kind of just on the precipice of that snowballing and, really having an impact on our economy, but also just, kind of our lives, I suppose, and shifting the way we think about how transport works and how fuel works in general. So I'm really excited about it because there's so much movement and traction, and with the new government taking more leadership in this arena is super exciting for me. But on the battery piece, so batteries, there's a few things I think I would like to share with batteries. And it's interesting. The Australian Financial Review, even today, has an article about the residential batteries basically not being value for money or not having a decent enough payback. And in some cases, that is true. It depends on the kind of battery and where you live and how you're, powering and stuff like that. But I know definitely the big utility scale batteries they're a no-brainer. and they will be continuing to be built out. I think ARENA is about to fund, I'm going to get this wrong too, but say 3 gigawatts worth of batteries in their funding. So that's the Renewable Energy Agency. And so, it's important to our system to include that capacity. And you're right, it does jack up the price of electricity. But it's needed in order to provide that reliability in the system, right? So as we move to more variable renewable energy sources as on the supply side, you can't just flip the switch and, everything's all fine and dandy on a solar farm or a wind farm. You need that resource available. So we do need storage in the system. Now, the thing with batteries is it's all systems go right now. There's a lot of players in the market. They want to invest in batteries. They want to deploy them everywhere. There's these renewable energy zones that state governments sort of propping up, and those all make sense, right? And the market that we operate in has so many different sort of products and services that you can leverage with a battery. So it's not just providing energy, it's providing capacity, it's providing, ancillary services, frequent response services, keeping that grid stable. And for each of those elements, there is a return. And in aggregate, it actually amounts to a pretty decent amount, especially when the grid is as volatile in operation as it has been in the last couple of years. So the business case for the big batteries is absolutely there. And that's why there's so much interest and there's heaps of money flowing into it. So from that perspective, it makes a lot of sense. There would have to be, because it's an open sort of free market, aside from the ARENA funding, there will have to be some floor to that investment. It's going to become less and less interesting to keep putting more and more batteries in there so that you can provide that last megawatt hour of storage in order to support the grid, right? So it's going to become less and less lucrative with each new battery that comes online, assuming their lifetime is good. So then to me, it becomes a question of, all right, so how do you supply that end megawatt hour that ensures grid stability so that everyone, can have their lights on and have their heating, run those processes so that we can make, export grade products and things. And I think that last piece, the private equity markets, capital market, they will leave. They're not going to want to fund reliability in the system. That's not for them. They're not making money out of that, right? So to me, that is where the government should be spending its money, on that last kind of piece. So that includes things like transmission, getting everything where it needs to go, but then also on the storage and capacity and firming elements. And they are doing that. So that's what Snowy 2.0, this large, pumped hydro scheme in New South Wales is going to be. And then they also, not that long ago, announced that there would be federal funding for the Hydro Tasmania sort of equivalent project called Battery of the Nation, which is another pumped hydro scheme down in Tassie, which would be connected through a new subsea cable from Tasmania to Victoria called Mariners Link. So I think those two, plus there's other pumped hydro projects that are being talked about. Pumped hydro is not the cheapest form of storage. Hydro itself is it's a cheap form of energy, but it's also not the cheapest form of energy from a sort of marginal cost perspective. So but what it does do is provide that reliability and insurance in a way for the system, so that it can help to provide stability and get us as a system to the place we need to be in order to generate the electricity and energy that is needed so that we can have, a thriving decarbonized economy.
And when it comes to kind of decentralized energy and the potential for SMEs. Do you have any particular views on that?
Yeah, so there's a few things that I would say at the moment, right? A lot of SMEs can just go to a retailer, they can get an energy contract. They're sort of in this sort of in-between market at the moment, right? It's regulated in a slightly different way to what a big energy user, the rules around big energy users, and it's regulated in a different way to residential energy users. So because they're in the middle, they sort of get these middle rules. And sometimes it can be really expensive energy that they get lumped with, especially, network costs and things like that. But sometimes it's not too bad. So for them, it kind of does pay to shop around. But for those that are looking to specifically reduce their, energy costs as well as their emissions, there's a couple of things to do. I mean, if they haven't considered already or haven't been bombarded by, at least a dozen different companies already, solar on premises is a really good way to reduce energy costs and carbon at the same time, right? So, but those things rely on you need to either have a probably longish term lease or own your building. Not all of them have that. You have to have a decent rooftop. Again, not all of them have that. But if you do happen to have those things, it's probably the biggest no-brainer. You're essentially hedging your future energy with your own on-site generation, and it's super cheap. And let's face it, it's pretty easy. Even if you don't have the capital for it, there are lots of different models out there. If you don't have the cash to front it straight up. So power purchase agreements are one of them that aren't super common in Australia for some reason, but I think actually should play a bigger role. Basically getting someone else to own it, throw it in there, and then after 10 or 15 years, you can own that asset and the residual. And considering these things will last 25, 30 years, I feel like that's kind of a no-brainer. You're not putting any capital up front and you're paying a lower cost of energy over that sort of agreement term. So that would be my first kind of thing. Potentially second thing. The first thing really should be take a look at your energy use and energy efficiency measures. So I know that you had a bit of a chat about that with, was it Jim McGuire with energy efficiency? Yeah, in podcast number 6. So, those ones usually have the best payback. They'll be usually 1 to 3 years, and the capital costs are usually smaller. So I would say do that first, get your baseline, what that's going to be. If you're going to switch something from gas to electricity, figure out what that new electricity use would be. And then, hedge between sort of 20 and 50% of your energy use, whatever you can, by doing on-site generation, solar. It makes sense in so much of Australia. I think you'd be hard-pressed to get a system that isn't, doesn't have double-digit IRR for a solar system here. So that would be kind of it. And then most companies will still have some residual that they'll need from the grid, unless you're putting a giant battery or you're doing some sort of generation and you're essentially off grid, you're going to still need some import from the grid. So if it's really important to have, no emissions or low emissions, then there are different ways to go about it. A corporate power purchase agreement, which again, I think you had a chat with Steve Liu in podcast number 3. So this is just like a shout out, all of these subjects have already been covered by Joseph's podcast. So go back and listen to them. But, that power purchase agreement for corporates is rising in Australia as well. So if you're big enough, then you can just buy offtake from the solar farm or wind farm directly for your residual grid requirement. And there are different business models, obviously, for that, and it may or may not be suitable for you as an SME. Now, the issue with corporate power purchase agreements usually is that the kind of demand that an SME requires, like your energy use for the year, is far too low for most of these companies to even want to do the transaction with you, right? It's usually really large scale stuff, which is unfortunate because it doesn't have to be that complicated again. And this is, I guess, a bit of a blatant plug, but one of my my company's one of the cool products that we have is a corporate power purchase agreement, but it has no lower limit for businesses. So you do have to be a business, it's not for residential use, but you can get access to energy from one of our Tasmanian wind farms. And it's it looks and feels like a retail contract, but you're getting it from a single like wind farm, a single generation asset. So every other element, and you're getting the renewable energy credits and environmental rights to it. So for the most part, it looks and feels like a contract that you're very used to signing anyway. But then it comes with all these other bells and whistles that I think tick the box for so many sort of sustainability elements. And you can market that to your customers, and you can market that to your stakeholders, your board, your investors, whoever you want. So it becomes like a talking point and a point of differentiation. And it also gives you sort of a bit more social license. So, if that's important to your business, then I do think it's something you should definitely be considering.
And Rebecca, what's the typical tenure of these contracts in your experience?
The general corporate, the landscape is changing a lot, but the general CPPA tenures, I would say 10 years, Wow, if you're going direct to an asset, and this is for the big end of town, they'll want, between 7 and 12 years, something like that, right? The thing with ours and the sort of look and feel of a normal retail energy contract, we can contract it for 2 years. We can contract it for 5 years. We generally don't contract longer than 5 years. So, that's another barrier, I guess, for some of the smaller end of town wanting to get into, this energy space that usually is reserved for the big end of town. Let's just put it that way.
And is the energy price pretty much fixed because it's from renewable energy, or is it based on the wholesale market?
Yeah, so you can have it either way. My recommendation is to know what you're playing with. So if you want a contract for a couple of years, then you can fix it, and we'll provide firming as well. So we can, if the wind isn't blowing from that asset at that particular time, but you want to be consuming it, we also have our hydro assets that you can get renewables from. So we've sort of got backups for it as well, which a lot of the other corporate PPAs don't necessarily have. It's sort of a take it or leave it type arrangement. So I think what we have is pretty unique, and I'm fairly proud of it in the sense that it does open up this new area of the market so that they can list all those credentials like the big end of town can.
That's great. So now, with your permission, I want to move to kind of the last part of the conversation, and I just wanted to ask you for your kind of personal long-term views and forecasts. And here we're talking about the next 28 years in terms of, future gazing predictions on some of the kind of fundamental shifts, particularly focused on the SMEs.
Yeah. So, future gazing, I love that. In the past, it really could have been anything. But let's face it, I think with the new government and the way that the energy markets are sort of shaping up, we kind of know what the next 5 to 10 years are going to look like. To me, the electricity side of the decarbonisation movement is while it's not entirely set in stone, there is a very clear pathway there. Like it's not really that complicated. Sure, there's technical elements to it. There will be a little bit more tech that has to come into it from an IT perspective to help with things. But we know how to do solar. We know how to do wind. Like we're figuring out like the big pumped hydro stuff. The batteries are in there already, and they're only going to get better from a tech perspective. And then we just have to work on the transmission. So like that part is quite clear. And I don't think there's any, revelation to be had in the supply side of decarbonisation and energy of electricity. I think what's more interesting is the demand side and what's going to happen there, and particularly from that tech kind of area, and also just from the dynamics on the demand side impacting the supply side. So, what happens when we do have a vehicle fleet in 20 years' time that is 80% electric? What does that do to our electricity system? What happens when, we decide as a nation that maybe we can get on without having much of a domestic gas supply? So, let's move all of our domestic stuff to electricity and electrify everything from everyone's household. No more gas cooktops. It's all induction cooktops. No more gas hot water. No more gas heating. Maybe your barbecue's still gas. I don't know. I feel like that one's a bridge too far for Australians. But, everything else turns to electricity. And then certainly that your electricity is from a renewable energy source because you've got solar on your roof, you got a battery in your garage, you got an EV in your garage there too. And, your energy bill says that you're getting 100% green power from the grid. So, that piece is kind of more interesting, I suppose. But it's also like this piece around, I guess, that the prosumer and energy autonomy and having a customer decide when and how they use energy at any particular time. So the, I guess, automation, be it in home of you have your solar, you have a battery, you have your electric vehicle. Maybe your electric vehicle can do vehicle to grid. Now, I do think that tech is actually further off than most people realize it is, but at some point it will come into play. So, and then there's all of the different appliances and the way that you're using electricity. So there's got to be like a smartening almost of this like microgrid type environment. And I'm using a house just because I feel like it's relatable, right? A relatable sort of scenario to think about. But if you then expand that to, a commercial sort of entity, an office building or whatever, or you expand that out to an industry or a factory that has maybe multiple megawatts of solar on their roof or they have, cold storage, like we've got freezers and fridges, or they have different kind of batch processes that they can turn on and off, as it makes sense for them. So, or even taking it out of the house context and making it more of a community level sort of thing. So if the Australian Financial Review has, this article that says in-home batteries don't really make sense, then what about community battery, So, and I know a lot of the networks are spending a lot of time and effort putting in place this kind of infrastructure at a community level or at like the distribution level. So knowing that the demand side is really where we're going to have a lot more play or flexibility, I suppose, in order to balance the supply and demand side. So I guess when I think about that sort of future gazing and future perspectives, to me, it's really all about customer use, how the end game is kind of working, how our appliances are working, how our distribution networks are working, how the electrification of vehicles is kind of going and where that charging infrastructure needs to be. and just that general use. And then how much is being generated at that community or residential or, building level as well. That sort of microgrid element of it. And I think that to me, there's a lot more unknowns. So it's a lot more exciting for me anyway. I like the kind of ambiguity, because with the unknown becomes there's so much opportunity, and you can forge a path or create something that is really actually going to make a big difference. I feel there's a lot more that Australia can do because of our unique way of operating our energy system. There's only a few places in the world that kind of work the way that we do. And I think it gives us, a great opportunity to not just we can create the tech in Australia that works for our domestic energy market, but then we have this opportunity to then export that tech, because eventually most of the world's going to be requiring that sort of stuff as well.
Just one final point, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but do you see over the next 3 to 5 years an acceleration at the SME level in terms of decarbonization solutions?
I don't know if I would say an acceleration of it. I think there's already interest, but there are barriers. So there may be a removal of those barriers to a certain extent. I think what will happen is that the energy market will almost just sort of slowly integrate and sort of evolve into this greened sort of version of itself. Firstly pulled along by those entities that want it to green, and then it's sort of like forced upon those who are quite indifferent, So it will be a push and pull kind of element to it, I suppose, or push and just washed over. Right now, the big risk in the market and the issue that people are trying to overcome is how do you decipher greenwashing? What is greenwashing and what isn't? What is acceptable for social license and what isn't? And I think right now that's another barrier, because there's a lot of people spruiking green products, but customers and investors are really smart, and they can see through a lot of green marketing veil, So businesses have to be really careful with the things that they take on board and what they try to spruik in order to differentiate themselves. Because customers see straight through it. They're really smart. You can't trick them into anything.
Got it. Well, Rebecca, look, I'm very, very grateful for your time. I know you've got 2 full-time jobs, the kids at home and the hydrotest job. So never easy. So very, very grateful for your time, for your insights, and really enjoyed the conversation.
Yeah, it's been lovely catching up and chatting. And I'm looking forward to hearing all of the next podcast episodes as well. So keep up the good stuff. Thank you.
Thank you again, Rebecca. Thank you. Thank you for listening to the Asia Climate Capital podcast. If you want more information or you would like to send some comments or ideas for future topics, our contact is in the show notes. Thank you again.